November 20th, 1943. The target? A tiny smear of sand in the Pacific called Betio. The plan? A swift, overwhelming amphibious assault. U.S. Marine planners told their men the battle would be over in a day, maybe less. They were dead wrong. A disastrously low tide, a fatal oversight in the planning, would turn a 500-yard trip to the beach into a death march. For 76 nightmarish hours, thousands of Marines were forced to wade through chest-deep water straight into a perfectly prepared Japanese kill zone. This is the story of how a plan for a quick victory spiraled into one of the most savage and costly battles in Marine Corps history. Section 1. The strategic context, the why. By 1943, the tide of the war in the Pacific was finally turning. The great naval victories at Midway and the bloody slog on Guadalcanal had blunted Japan's advance. Now, American war planners, under the command of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, wanted to go on the offensive. Their strategy was bold and brutal. Island hopping. Instead of getting bogged down, attacking every fortified Japanese island, the plan was to leapfrog across the Pacific, capturing smaller, strategically vital islands to build forward air bases. These bases would act as unsinkable aircraft carriers, pushing American air power closer and closer to Japan. The first step in this grand campaign was a drive through the Central Pacific, with the ultimate goal of reaching the Mariana Islands. But to get there, American forces needed a foot in the door of Japan's outer defenses. That door was the Gilbert Islands, and in the Gilberts, one tiny island held the key. Betio, the largest island in the Tarawa atoll. Betio itself was minuscule, less than 3 miles long and barely half a mile wide. But on that sandbar, the Japanese had built a critical airstrip, a dagger aimed at Allied sea lanes. That airstrip had to be taken. The mission, codenamed Operation Galvanic, was given to the 2nd Marine Division, veterans resting in New Zealand after the hell of Guadalcanal. This would be the first major American offensive in the Central Pacific. More importantly, it would be the first time U.S. forces attempted a full-scale amphibious assault against a heavily fortified beach. At Guadalcanal, the initial landing had been unopposed. The real fight came later. Tarawa would be different. The battle would be won or lost on the beach in the first few hours. It was the ultimate test of the amphibious doctrine the Marines had spent years developing. Confidence was sky high. The invasion force was the largest yet seen in the Pacific. 17 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. The fleet carried the roughly 18,000 Marines of the 2nd Division, part of a total force of about 35,000 men. To the planners, throwing the industrial might of the United States against 1 square mile of coral seemed like a foregone conclusion. One officer, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Amey, told his men, "We are very fortunate. This is the first time the Japs have had the hell kicked out of them in a hurry." The battle was expected to be a walk in the park, but on that tiny island, a Japanese commander was waiting, ready to turn their walk in the park into a graveyard. Section 2. The plan, the how. The plan for Operation Galvanic was classic American military thinking. Overwhelm the enemy with methodical, brutal firepower. The objective was the airfield on Betio and the 2nd Marine Division, led by Major General Julian C. Smith, had a straightforward plan to take it. The main assault would hit the northern beaches of the island. Codenamed Red Beach 1, 2, and 3, the attack would kick off with one of the most intense naval bombardments of the war. For hours, battleships and cruisers would pound the island into dust. The naval commander, Rear Admiral Howard F. Kingman, famously promised the Marines, "Gentlemen, we will not neutralize Betio. We will not destroy it. We will obliterate it." After the Navy was done, carrier aircraft would swoop in to finish the job. By the time the first Marine landed, planners believed the island would be a smoking ruin. The first waves would ride ashore in a revolutionary new vehicle, the Landing Vehicle Tracked, or LVT. Nicknamed the Alligator, this lightly armored amphibian could crawl over the coral reefs that would stop a normal landing craft. 125 LVTs were tasked with carrying the first waves of Marines right onto the sand, ready to fight. For the first time, the Marines would be riding, not wading, into battle. Subsequent waves, carrying more infantry, tanks, and artillery, would follow in standard Higgins boats, LCVPs. These plywood boats were expected to land easily once the tide was high enough to let them clear the reef. It was a meticulous plan of fire and steel. Intelligence estimated about 4,700 defenders on the island, a mix of elite Japanese Marines and Korean laborers forced to build the fortifications. They were tough, but no one thought they could stand up to the sheer power about to be unleashed on them. Everything seemed accounted for, but warfare is where plans collide with reality. The Japanese commander on Betio, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, wasn't planning on being obliterated. He had turned the island into a fortress of coconut logs, concrete, and interlocking fields of fire. His defenses were designed to survive the bombardment and slaughter the attackers on the beach. Shibasaki had boasted to his men that it would take 1 million men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. As the American fleet steamed closer, Shibasaki and his men waited, ready to make them pay for every single inch of sand. Section 3. The flaw foreshadowing the twist. Every great plan has a weak spot, a single point of failure that can bring the whole thing crashing down. For Operation Galvanic, it wasn't a failure of firepower or courage. It was a force of nature that was tragically overlooked, the tide. The entire plan depended on the depth of the water over the jagged coral reef that fringed Betio, a submerged fence stretching 500 to 800 yards from the beaches. The LVTs could crawl over it, but every wave after that, the men, the tanks, the supplies, would come in shallow draft Higgins boats. For those boats to clear the reef, they needed at least 4 to 5 feet of water. Naval planners, using old charts, knew about the reef and studied the tides. They made a prediction. On the morning of November the 20th, a high tide would give them the clearance they needed. It was a critical assumption, the linchpin of the whole operation. But there were warnings. A few officers with local knowledge, including some New Zealanders, cautioned that the islands were prone to neap tides, a period of unusually low tidal variation. If the invasion hit during a neap tide, the water over the reef might only be 2 or 3 feet deep. Not nearly enough for the Higgins boats. The planners heard the warnings, but they were on a tight schedule. Shifting the date of Operation Galvanic would throw the entire Pacific War timetable into chaos, so they made a fateful choice. They rolled the dice and stuck with the plan, betting the tide would be on their side. It was a catastrophic gamble. November 20th, 1943, fell squarely in the middle of a neap tide. The confident prediction of 5 feet of water was a fantasy. On the morning of the assault, there would be, at best, 3 feet. Admiral Shibasaki didn't know about this flaw in the American plan. He didn't need to. He had designed his defenses specifically to turn the area between the reef and the beach into a kill zone. His guns were zeroed in on the reef. His machine gunners had fields of fire covering every square yard of the approach. He wasn't planning to fight the Americans at sea. He was planning to kill them in the water, trapped and exposed. The perfect plan was about to meet the perfect defense, and the deciding vote would be cast by the silent, unforgiving pull of the moon. Section 4. The Battle, the What? Day 1. November 20th, 1943. The meat grinder at 05:05. The U.S. Navy opened fire, and the world exploded. From the transport ships, Marines watched as Bastogne vanished under a cloud of smoke and steel. For nearly 3 hours, the island was hammered relentlessly. It seemed impossible for anyone to survive. War correspondent Robert Sherrod wrote, "Surely they would all be dead by now." They weren't. As the bombardment lifted, Japanese defenders, shaken but mostly protected by their bunkers, rushed to their guns. When the first wave of 125 LVTs churned toward the beach, the lagoon erupted in gunfire. The lightly armored LVTs were prime targets, and many were knocked out. Still, most pushed through, delivering the first Marines onto the beaches. They were immediately pinned down behind a low seawall of coconut logs, their only cover. Then came the second wave, and the plan fell apart. The Higgins boats hit the hidden reef and ground to a stop, hundreds of yards from shore. The neap tide had left them stranded. For the thousands of Marines inside, there was only one choice: get out and wade. What followed was a slow-motion nightmare. Weighed down by up to 90 pounds of gear, the Marines jumped into chest-deep water and began the long walk to shore, completely exposed. The water turned red as Japanese machine guns opened up, scything them down by the hundreds. Men were shot and simply disappeared under the waves, weighed down by their equipment. Command and control vanished. Saltwater-soaked radios, rendering them useless. Units were shattered, leaders were killed, and the attack devolved into a desperate struggle for individual survival. By the end of day 1, the situation was catastrophic. Of the 5,000 Marines sent ashore, around 100 were dead or wounded. The survivors clung to tiny, isolated beachheads just yards deep. The landing force commander, Colonel David M. Shoup, set up a command post under fire on a long pier, trying to orchestrate the chaos. Wounded himself, he sent back a message of pure defiance. Casualties, many. Percentage of dead, not known. Combat efficiency, we are winning. Day 2, November 21st, 1943, an inch at a time. Dawn, on the second day, revealed a scene from hell. The lagoon was a junkyard of wrecked boats and floating bodies. The beaches were littered with the dead. The surviving Marines were exhausted, low on ammo, and desperate for water. The main struggle was just getting reinforcements and supplies ashore. The tide was still too low. A few surviving LVTs made heroic, desperate trips back and forth from the reef, ferrying men and supplies under constant fire. But there weren't nearly enough. On the island, the fighting was intimate and brutal. It became a battle of bunkers. Marines had to take out the Japanese pillboxes one by one with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades. Progress was measured in feet, and every foot was paid for in blood. Major Michael P. Ryan, finding himself the senior officer in his sector, gathered a force of survivors that became known as Ryan's Orphans, and began a slow, grinding attack inland. Crucially, the Japanese command structure was breaking down. Admiral Shibasaki had been killed in his command post during the initial naval bombardment. Without his leadership, the Japanese defenders fought with suicidal bravery in isolated pockets, but they couldn't organize a coordinated counterattack to push the Marines back into the sea. This failure of command was just enough to allow the battered Americans to hang on. By nightfall, they had landed a few tanks and consolidated their beachheads, but the battle's outcome was still terrifyingly uncertain. Day 3, November 22nd, 1943. The tide turns on the morning of the third day. The tide finally, literally, began to turn. The water rose just enough to let more landing craft, especially those carrying Sherman tanks, get over the reef. The arrival of armor was decisive. The tanks could roll right up to the Japanese bunkers and blast them open at point-blank range, succeeding where naval gunfire had failed. With tank support and fresh troops from the 6th Marine Regiment, the Marines began to push across the island. The fighting was still savage. The Japanese defenders, following the Bushido Code, refused to surrender. They fought to the last man, often launching suicidal banzai charges into the teeth of Marine machine guns. In one of the battle's most heroic actions, Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman Jr. led an assault against a massive Japanese bomb-proof shelter. He and his small team fought their way to the roof, using flamethrowers and explosives to silence the strongpoint that had held up the advance. Bonnyman was killed on top of the bunker and was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. By evening, the Marines had seized the airfield and pushed the last Japanese defenders to the eastern tip of the island. That night, several hundred remaining Japanese soldiers launched a final, massive banzai charge. They were annihilated in a storm of machine gun fire. At 1:30 p.m. on November 23rd, after 76 brutal hours, Major General Julian C. Smith declared Bastogne secure. The battle for Tarawa was over. Section 5. The Aftermath and Cost. When the shooting stopped, Bastogne was a wasteland. The island had been stripped of vegetation, a hellscape of craters and shattered fortifications. The air was thick with the smell of death. In just 76 hours, the Marine Corps had suffered over 300 casualties, with more than 1,000 killed or missing, a number comparable to the entire 6-month Guadalcanal campaign. The 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, whose LVTs were the heroes of the landing, lost over half its men and nearly all of its vehicles. For the Japanese, the cost was total annihilation. Of the approximately 400 Japanese troops and Korean laborers on the island, only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Koreans were taken prisoner. The rest fought to the death. In total, nearly 600 men died on and around that tiny strip of sand. The news from Tarawa sent a shockwave through the United States. The American public, used to news of cleaner victories, was horrified by the butcher's bill for such a small island. For the first time, uncensored footage and photos showed the brutal reality of the Pacific War, and there was an outcry. Mothers wrote to Admiral Nimitz, accusing him of murder. The Navy also suffered a major loss during the operation when the escort carrier USS Liscombe Bay was sunk by a Japanese submarine near Macon Island, killing 702 sailors. The dead on Bastogne were buried in makeshift cemeteries. But due to the chaos and subsequent airfield construction, many graves were lost. For decades, hundreds of Marines were listed as unrecoverable, Only in recent years have organizations like History Flight begun to locate these lost burial sites, identifying the remains of these fallen heroes, and finally bringing them home to their families. The cost of Tarawa wasn't just measured in 76 hours, but in the decades of grief for the families of the missing. Section 6. The Lesson/Legacy, the Why It Matters. The Battle of Tarawa was a tactical victory won at a staggering price. But its true importance lies in the brutal lessons that were learned. The bloody mistakes at Tarawa became the catalyst for a revolution in American amphibious warfare, saving countless lives in the even bigger battles to come. The failures were laid bare. First, the catastrophic intelligence failure on the tides. This led directly to the creation of the Navy's underwater demolition teams, WW2's, the forerunners of today's Navy SEALs, whose job was to scout landing beaches and clear obstacles before an invasion. The naval bombardment was found to be too short and used the wrong kind of ammunition. Future bombardments would be longer and use armor-piercing shells. Close air support and battlefield communications were completely overhauled. Waterproof radios and dedicated command ships became standard. And the LVT, the hero of the landing, was transformed. The lightly protected alligators were too vulnerable. New armored versions called AM-tanks were developed, armed with cannons and heavy machine guns, giving infantry their own mobile fire support. These lessons were put into practice almost immediately. Just 10 weeks later, at the invasion of Kwajalein, the results were dramatic. With better reconnaissance, bombardment, and armored LVTs, casualties were a fraction of those at Tarawa. The bloody lessons learned at Tarawa were already saving lives, and they would inform every major amphibious landing for the rest of the war, from Saipan to Iwo Jima and even at Normandy. As Admiral Nimitz later said, the capture of Tarawa knocked down the front door to the Japanese defenses in the Central Pacific. It was the key that unlocked the door to victory, a key forged in fire and paid for with blood. Conclusion. The story of Tarawa is a testament to the raw courage of the men who waded into that meat grinder and a chilling reminder of the terrible cost of war. It was a suicide mission that succeeded through sheer grit, a battle that was almost lost, but ultimately became a crucial, if brutal, lesson. The sacrifice of the men who died in those 76 hours was not in vain. It reshaped the course of the Pacific War. Their names, once lost to the sands of a remote island, are a permanent symbol of valor against impossible odds. If you found this piece of history compelling, please consider subscribing for more stories of the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Thank you for watching.